Hey there, ready to dive into something a little unexpected? We're going deep on a topic that might surprise you. Poverty. I know, not exactly your typical lighthearted podcast fare, but trust me, this is way more interesting than you might think.
What's fascinating is that we're often conditioned to see poverty as purely negative, a problem to be solved. But what if we looked at it from a completely different angle?
That's exactly what we're doing today. We're taking you back to 1708 with excerpts from Triumphs of Poverty by Rabbi David Nieto. It explores how poverty, within a spiritual context, might actually be a source of strength.
The book opens with a paradox that might resonate with you. Everyone seems to respect poverty, but no one wants it. Nieto even poses this question directly to the reader. Why is this?
He really makes you stop and think right. We admire those who live simply, detached from material wealth, but would we ever want to trade places?
Exactly. Nieto argues that poverty can be the very foundation of devotion and humility. There's a quote that really struck me. He who has nothing to lose is free to pursue the truest riches.
Wow, that's powerful. So he's suggesting that poverty, in a way, liberates us from the anxieties of material possessions and allows us to focus on something deeper.
Precisely. And this idea isn't unique to Nieto. It echoes ancient philosophies like Stoicism, which also challenged the pursuit of wealth. Think of figures like Socrates or Diogenes, both renowned for rejecting material possessions and embracing a life of simplicity and virtue.
Okay, so we're starting to see how poverty might be linked to personal growth. But Nieto takes it a step further and introduces a spiritual dimension. He asks, is there anyone closer to God than the poor? And he uses the prophet Elijah as a prime example.
Now, Elisha was this incredibly powerful prophet, capable of commanding heaven and earth, but he lived a life of poverty, constantly on the move, reliant on the kindness of others.
It's like he had nothing in a worldly sense, yet he possessed immense spiritual power. That challenges our usual assumptions about success, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Nieto uses this example to illustrate the idea that material wealth doesn't necessarily translate into spiritual wealth. He's highlighting this contrast between temporal assets, what we possess in this world, and the spiritual assets that hold true value in a divine sense.
So poverty might even be advantageous when it comes to spiritual growth.
That's the argument Nieto is building. To understand this further, he uses a fascinating metaphor from the book of Ezekiel, the vision of the chariot.
Okay, I remember reading about that. There's a chariot, and it's pulled by these four fantastical creatures, right? But how does this tie into poverty?
This is where it gets really interesting. The chariot itself symbolizes divine power, and its journey upwards represents spiritual ascension. Each of the four figures pulling the chariot, the man, the lion, the ox, and the eagle, represents a different path to virtue.
So the chariot is like a vehicle for reaching a higher spiritual state, and the figures represent different ways to get there.
Exactly. Now, pay close attention to the ox.
Yeah.
The ox, in this metaphor, represents the poor man who labors tirelessly and endures suffering with patience.
Hold on. So the poor man, the one we usually see as lacking, is actually one of the figures pulling this divine chariot toward heaven.
Precisely. And Nieto emphasizes that despite their differences, all four figures are equally successful in reaching their destination. It's not about the specific path, but the commitment and sincerity you bring to your journey.
That's a powerful message. It suggests that even those who appear disadvantaged in a worldly sense can achieve spiritual heights.
Exactly. But now get this, in a later vision, the positions of the figures actually change, and the opus, representing the poor, is elevated above all the others.
Whoa, that's a pretty significant shift. What does that mean?
This elevation signifies the spiritual advantage of poverty within Jewish mystical thought. It's the idea that through hardship and humility, the poor develop a unique reliance on God, a kind of spiritual strength that surpasses even the virtues of the wealthy, the wise, or the devout.
That's a bold statement. You're telling me that in this vision, the poor man, the ox, ends up at the forefront of this spiritual journey.
Exactly. And this leads us to another fascinating argument, the concept of divine justice, and how poverty might actually grant a unique access to God's grace.
Okay. Now you've really got my attention. Tell me more about this divine justice angle.
Well, Nieto describes two metaphorical courts in heaven, the court of justice and the court of grace. The court of justice is where our actions and merits are judged, a classic weighing of the scales. But the court of grace, he says, is open to the poor, and their cries are heard more readily there.
So it's like a spiritual fast track.
In a way, yes. He uses the example of King David's plea in Psalm 86, where David, despite being king, emphasizes his poverty and neediness above his other virtues as he appeals to God.
It's almost like he's saying his poverty gives him a stronger claim to God's mercy than all his accomplishments.
Exactly. And Nieto compares this to the stories of the prophets Elijah, who we know is poor, and Elisha, who was wealthy. Elijah's requests were often granted quickly and easily, while Elisha faced more challenges. So it's not about God playing favorites, but perhaps about how poverty can cultivate a deeper dependence on God, a humility that makes us more receptive to divine grace.
So we've gone from poverty as a potential path to spiritual growth, to it being a possible key to divine favor. But are you ready for this next idea? Nieto states that the poor are like the dead, and he means this in a good way.
I know, it sounds shocking, right? But it's this really thought-provoking comparison. Think about it. Both the poor and the dead are often forgotten or ignored by society. But Nieto suggests that this can actually be a form of liberation, a detachment from worldly concerns and attachments.
So in a sense, they're already living a kind of spiritual life that others have to work hard to achieve.
Precisely. This freedom from the distractions of possessions and status can create space for a more profound spiritual connection. And this brings us back to the idea of the triumphs of poverty. It's not about material wealth or social standing, but rather about cultivating the inner qualities, humility, reliance on God, detachment, that lead to true fulfillment. And this detachment can be especially powerful in a world that constantly pressures us to accumulate more, to strive for external validation.
It's like the poor, in their very lack of worldly possessions, are demonstrating a different way of being, one that's not driven by those external forces. But doesn't that also make them more vulnerable in a practical sense?
Absolutely. And Nieto doesn't shy away from acknowledging the very real challenges of poverty. He brings up the concept of midot, Hebrew for character traits or virtues.
Okay, so how do these midot tie into poverty?
Nieto argues that the experience of poverty can actually help cultivate these positive qualities. He quotes Rabbi Moses Almosnino, who wrote extensively about developing strong character in the face of hardship. Almosnino even references Plato, advocating for instilling these virtues in children from a young age.
So learning to find contentment and meaning in simple things could help us resist the allure of greed and materialism later in life.
Precisely. But Nieto is also a realist. He doesn't romanticize poverty. He even quotes Aristotle, who questioned why poverty seems more prevalent among good people.
That's an interesting question. Why would that be?
Nieto suggests that perhaps poverty seeks refuge among the righteous, because it knows it will be treated with more respect and compassion there. He acknowledges that poverty can expose us to both the best and worst of humanity.
It's a sobering thought, but also a reminder that true character is often revealed in the face of adversity. So it's not about glorifying poverty, but recognizing its potential to refine us, deepen our spiritual understanding.
Exactly. And he even tackles the age-old question of whether poverty is a matter of choice, or perhaps even divine decree. He explores the contrasting views of Rabbi Meir, who believe wealth and poverty are determined by merit, and Rabbah, who saw it as a matter of fortune.
It's that classic debate, nature versus nurture, or in this case, merit versus fate.
Right. Nieto tries to reconcile these seemingly opposing views by suggesting that while God might have a plan for us, our actions and choices can influence our circumstances.
So it's not a purely deterministic view. We still have agency.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of stars and planets. They might indicate a certain destiny, but through good deeds and spiritual growth, we can overcome initial limitations.
So even if we're born into poverty, we're not necessarily bound by those circumstances. Our choices, our actions can make a difference. That's empowering.
And it connects to this fascinating point Nieto makes about the voluntary detachment from material possessions throughout history. He mentions figures like Socrates and his students who chose to live simply in pursuit of intellectual and spiritual fulfillment.
It reminds me of that famous quote from Augustine. Any abundance that is not God is nothing but poverty.
Exactly. True wealth lies in our connection to something larger than ourselves, something that transcends the material world.
And this ties beautifully into the Jewish concept of tzedakah, which is often translated as charity, but it has a much deeper meaning, right?
Absolutely. It's about righteous giving, about recognizing our responsibility to care for those in need. And Nieto highlights that while the wealthy might give more in terms of material resources, the poor can contribute through their own acts of kindness and compassion.
So it's not just about money, but a spirit of generosity, of selflessness, no matter your circumstances.
Precisely. And Nieto draws a powerful parallel between the generosity of the wealthy and the patience and resilience of the poor. He suggests both are valuable expressions of tzedakah.
So in a sense, he's suggesting that poverty might even enhance our capacity for empathy and compassion because we understand hardship firsthand.
Right. When you face challenges yourself, you're more likely to understand and connect with the struggles of others.
He even makes the point that the poor are often more willing to help each other than the wealthy are to help the poor. It reminds me of that John Steinbeck quote, "If you're in trouble or hurt or need, go to the poor people. They're the only ones that'll help."
It's a poignant observation about the innate generosity and solidarity often found in communities facing shared hardships. So we've seen how poverty might be a path to spiritual growth, how it can nurture virtues like humility and compassion, even offer access to a different kind of justice, the justice of grace. But what was Nieto's ultimate goal in writing this book?
That's a great question. I mean, it seems like he's making a strong case for embracing poverty, but I can't imagine he expected everyone to give up their possessions and live on the streets.
You're right, he wasn't advocating for universal poverty. Remember, he delivered this as a speech during the inauguration of a Jewish charitable organization called Bikur Holim, which focused on caring for the sick.
Ah, so he was trying to inspire action, encourage people to support those in need.
Exactly. He was challenging his audience to look beyond the material aspects of poverty, to recognize the inherent dignity and worth of those who were struggling. He wanted them to see those struggles not just as a source of suffering, but also as a potential source of spiritual strength and growth.
And to realize that by understanding the spiritual strengths of the poor, we might be more inclined to treat them with dignity and offer practical support.
Precisely. He was urging his audience to see poverty not as something to be feared or avoided, but as a reality to be understood, embraced, and ultimately transcended.
It's amazing how Nieto takes these complex ideas, philosophical, theological, even mystical, and weaves them into this compelling argument about the unexpected triumphs of poverty.
And he does it all while staying grounded in scripture and Jewish tradition. It's not just abstract theory. He's drawing on centuries of wisdom and insight to challenge our conventional thinking.
And it's so relevant even today. We live in a world that's constantly telling us that wealth and material success are the ultimate goals. It's easy to get caught up in that chase and lose sight of what truly matters.
Absolutely. Compassion, connection, meaning, purpose. These are the things that bring true fulfillment, yet they're often overshadowed by the pursuit of material wealth.
Nieto's work is like a powerful reminder that there's another way to live, a path that prioritizes spiritual growth and helping others over simply accumulating possessions.
And this path, while often challenging, can lead to a much deeper sense of fulfillment and connection with something greater than ourselves.
I'm thinking back to that idea we discussed earlier about poverty potentially enhancing our capacity for empathy and compassion.
It's a powerful concept. We tend to view poverty as a lack of something, a deficit. But Nieto challenges us to see it as a different kind of abundance, an abundance of heart, understanding, and resilience.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity regardless of material circumstances.
And understanding that true strength comes not from what we own, but from who we are and how we choose to live our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Nieto's triumphs of poverty, I want to leave you with a question. In a world that often glorifies wealth and material success, how might embracing the virtues of simplicity, humility, and reliance on a higher power help us find a different kind of fulfillment?
It's something worth pondering. Maybe true richness isn't about what we have, but about how we connect with something larger than ourselves, how we choose to live, and how we treat each other.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives to consider on